Hey everybody, Carl here from Apt, and we've got a lot of experts here at the store, and they have just a wealth of knowledge. So we brought one of them up here today to teach you how to set up your turntable. We've got Bill here with us. He's been at the store since 2003, so just a little shorter than me, but doesn't make him less of an expert. And he's gonna go over with us all the steps to take to really properly set up your turntable. So Bill, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Carl, I appreciate it. So turntable setup is pretty straightforward as long as you follow the steps. Most of the steps that you'll find when you pull out the packaging and the manual are just going to be unwrapping components and getting them ready to install. So the main thing to do is be careful when you're taking everything out of the package. Take all of the components out of the styrofoam. A lot of times things are packed underneath or inside styrofoam that you might not see immediately. So grab everything that the manual tells you is in the box so you have it at the ready. The first thing to do is take out the actual platter. All the components are sitting here, and I'll just go over those very briefly. The platter itself is what the record sits on top of. This is a felt mat that goes on top of the platter. That's mainly to protect the vinyl from touching the metal of the platter. In this case, it's aluminum.
So can I interrupt for a second?
By all means.
So when somebody's opening their turntable at home, are they generally going to see all of the pieces that we're looking at on the table here, or are there going to be instances where a turntable might not come with a mat for the top of the platter?
There are some cases where it might not come with a mat.
Okay.
Almost all of our turntables do come with a felt or a cork mat of some kind, but some of the models that have an acrylic platter, for instance, rather than aluminum, as is the case here, that would not have a mat included in the package.
Okay,
So,
now is there a reason why you wouldn't be able to use do you have to have a mat, basically, is what I'm asking?
good question. You don't have to.
Okay.
There are different schools of thought when it comes to how vinyl interacts with whatever surface it's on top of. The common knowledge is that acrylic works well by itself, but some people prefer it with a mat, with cork. It's really about personal preference, and there's no right or wrong as long as you don't have something that completely affects the VTA, the vertical tracking angle of the cartridge itself.
Okay.
So you can use it, and there are different options as aftermarket components that we actually sell. One that's made of leather, one that's cork, so you can buy different types of mats depending on your preference.
And that'll impact the music in subtle different ways?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep, sometimes subtle, not so much. And yeah, sometimes subtle and sometimes not so much, I should say. So we have everything kind of out of the box, including, in this case, two separate belts. One is for 78 RPM records and the other is for 33, 45. Since most people will be listening using 33 and 45, that's the one we're going to use in this instance. So an anti-skate weight that basically allows the tone arm to move toward the center of the record in a smooth, continuous fashion rather than being pulled in by centrifugal force. And power supply, a couple of different options in this case, European and some other power supply options. We're just using the good old North American adapter in this case. A 45 spindle adapter, and that goes right on the top there in case you want to play singles or 7-inch records. And then finally, the component that plugs your turntable into your audio system, the interconnect cable. In most cases, an interconnect cable for turntables will include a ground cable, which is a little horseshoe piece that's on the end of a line. Basically, that's to keep the 60 cycle hum that sometimes can affect turntables that's coming through your power line. So I always recommend keeping that plugged in. If you don't hear a hum when you're getting everything set up, you don't necessarily have to do it, but it's an easy thing, and I say better safe than sorry.
And is that a cable that you're going to find with most turntables that you get then, or is that often a separate piece that you're going to have to buy?
In the case of our inventory, every single model that we carry has a interconnect included.
Okay.
In some cases, many cases, as you move up the line with higher and higher performance turntables, people will prefer to buy their own and upgrade that, but it always is included in the box.
Okay.
So it's one of the few components on the market, a source component that does include exactly what you need without having to buy anything else.
Perfect.
So as far as the setup is concerned, we have everything out of the box now, and we're going to go ahead and get started. As far as the directions are concerned, I'm going to loosely follow them, but I've done this a few times, so it is something I'm just going to go ahead and move forward with my own explanation. So the belt is simply going to go from this spindle to this spindle. So you're going from a small spindle, I should say, to a large spindle. And basically all that's doing is the motor that's inside this unit will actually turn that belt, which will then turn this, and in effect turn the platter. So once the belt is on, it goes around a small section of the spindle here and around the entire spindle on that side, then you can place your platter. I always recommend that you do this with gloves or with extra clean hands, just because the cleaner the better when it comes to this kind of thing. Oil and residue from your fingertips will affect vinyl, so keep it as clean as you can. And I also recommend doing it when you have a lot of light in the room. Don't do this at night or when you're tired. It is something that requires a little bit of concentration.
So nothing to do right before bed.
Exactly, exactly. Now we have the platter in place. Basically, the only other thing we have to do is attach the anti-skate weight. In this case, it's just a very small weight that's on the end of a line. That attaches to a very small rod that's here on the back of the tone arm, and then it goes through this loop right here. So this will be attached.
Now, do some turntables come with the anti-skate weight already attached, or is that always going to be a separate piece that they have to put in themselves?
Great question and observation. Most of them come with a anti-skate function built onto the table itself. It might be in the form of a dial or a small rocker switch or something along those lines, and all it's really doing is applying more or less force to that tone arm so it either moves in correctly, or if you have a record that's extremely warped, you can actually move that so the needle will stay on the record better.
Okay.
Once that's in place, all you really have to do is unwrap the tone arm. In most cases, these come wrapped up with a twist tie just to keep it from moving around during shipment. And then on the front, you'll see it's a little guard for your stylus. The stylus is literally a piece of metal that holds a tip of some kind. It could be diamond in most cases, but it's always a very fragile material that you want to try to protect as best you can. So I recommend putting this on after your listening sessions, just in case somebody who doesn't use the turntable regularly accidentally harms the cartridge or the needle. It's a good idea to leave it on there also for dust reduction. Dust is one of the enemies of any vinyl playback system, or really audio playback systems in general. Heat, dust, and time are the three biggest enemies for audio.
We sell vacuums here too, so if you have a problem with dust, you can also shop at Apt for a vacuum.
Now, once you have that done, you put the record on the platter. By the way, I forgot to mention, plug the unit in. You'll have a right and a left, and on the back of the turntable you'll see they'll be labeled left and right. There's two outputs back there, plus the aforementioned ground cable lug. So plug those in on that end. On the other end of the turntable, or on the other end of this line, you'll plug into a preamp, an amplifier, a receiver, or whatever component you're using to play back the material. Most receivers nowadays have a phono preamp included. There was a while where they didn't. Most manufacturers have returned to it simply because of the resurgence of interest in vinyl. So I recommend using the phono preamp that's built into that component, or you can buy a separate phono preamplifier as a separate piece and plug that in, and there are upgrades to that technology as well.
Now, we also, I know, sell some turntables that have preamps built into them. Is there a good way that somebody can tell? So maybe they got one from a friend, or they took it from their parents' house or something. Is there a good way to tell whether it has a preamp built in or not?
In most cases, in almost every case that I've ever seen, there will be a switch somewhere on the back of the unit near where you plug things in, near the interconnect jack pack, that'll say line or phono.
Okay.
If it says line, or when it's switched to line, you'll be using the built-in phono preamp. If it says phono, then you're going to be using the phono preamp of the components you're plugging into.
So, okay, so if you're plugging your turntable into a receiver that has a phono input, you're going to set it to line.
You're going to set it to phono.
To phono.
Yeah.
To phono.
Yeah. If you're using the built-in phono preamp, you're going to be using line. Consider it line as the same signal as you'd get from a CD player or from a tuner or any other component that has a higher level output. The output from turntables is measured in millivolts, and it has to be preamplified before it gets to your receiver, preamplifier, or other component.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, so now you have your cords connected.
Now I have the cords plugged in.
And are those generally color-coded?
Yes,
there would be like a red and a white.
That's correct.
Typically,
yep. Red and white, and it's arbitrary which one you put on which, as long as it corresponds to whatever component you're plugging into.
Okay.
So if it's red into the left, for instance, make sure that the red is into the left on your receiver, preamplifier, whatever component you're plugging into. That's correct. Once you've done that, basically you'll switch the component, receiver, preamplifier, whatever you're using to play back music, whatever has the volume control on it, you'll switch that to the input labeled either phono or whichever line you've plugged into. If there is a built-in phono preamp and you plug it into, say, auxiliary, just switch the preamplifier or the receiver to auxiliary and you're ready to play music.
Sounds good. And that's it.
That's all there is to it.
Everything's set up.
Yeah, other than that, just start enjoying music. Should have mentioned, you do have to plug it in.
The most essential part.
You
Without that, you cannot listen to your music.
That's right.
So that's a great thing to do. Now, as I'm looking here at the back of the tone arm, there's another knob. It looks like. What is that control? What does that do?
That's super important, and I should have mentioned that much earlier. Thank you. That is a critical portion of this. Most turntables, when they arrive at a certain price point, will be set up and ready to go. There's nothing that has to be done to kind of get the turntable ready or to prepare it in any way. In the case of some higher quality turntables, however, you do have to basically balance the tone arm so it's set up for the right tracking force. And by that I mean the amount of force it puts down on the record. Too little and you're going to have very thin, bright sounding playback. Too much weight and it's going to sound very muffled and bass heavy.
And I would imagine too much weight can also damage the vinyl?
That's correct. Yep, exactly right. That needle should sit right in the groove. So there's a left and a right channel in every groove. That needle should touch both of those. If it's pushing too far down, you're literally going to be scraping vinyl off that record and cutting a new song.
Is there a good way to tell if it's sitting on there too heavy or if it's too light? Is there something somebody should listen for or look out for to know that they need to make an adjustment there?
That's a good question. Once it's set up the first time, you really shouldn't have to continue to check it, but if you do notice something that's off, we do have cartridge tracking force measuring devices that we sell. We sell one from Project that'll actually tell you exactly what it is. We're going to be doing it mostly by sight and by feel.
Okay.
That's adequate, more than adequate for most cartridges, but if you want to get to the nth degree and really make sure that the weight is exactly correct, one of those devices makes a lot of sense.
Okay. And now, so just so people can see in the video, if you were, so right as it sits right now, it's ready for a 33 or a 45, is that correct?
That's exactly right.
And now if somebody wanted to play a 78, they're going to have to switch the belt, which is not necessarily the case for all turntables, is that correct? Or
that's right.
So this one in particular, you'd have to switch the belt, and then you also have a piece that you would put on once the Platter's back on to fill in the gap.
No, you're thinking of 45s.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking. Okay, so that's that extra piece you use for a 45, but the different belt is going to be then for a 78.
Bingo, that's exactly right. And the 78's the same size, generally a 10 or 12 inch disc, as a conventional 33 is. So a long LP or long play record is 33 RPMs versus a 78. So you get about maybe 1/3 of the amount of information on a 78. But the belt is there. You simply switch that belt for this, put the Platter back in place, and you're ready to roll.
And does the belt go in the same spot then?
It does.
Okay,
yes.
So it's just a smaller belt. It's going to move it at a slower speed.
It's a round belt versus a flat belt.
I don't know much about turntables, so I'm asking on behalf of the people watching too.
Sure. The 78s, it's I can't explain, frankly, why they use a round versus a flat belt. I don't know. I just know that they generally do have a round belt. Yeah. Yep. I don't know if it has to do with the how smooth the Platter turns or exactly what it does differently. I might have to do a little research on that.
Well, that's okay.
That's a great question.
As long as it works, it works.
As long as it works. And frankly, the belt that's there for a 33 or 45 will work for 78s. It's not like it won't work. It's just not optimized like this belt is according to the vendor. Okay,
so if somebody didn't want to go through the trouble, you could still put a 78 on here, as long as you have the player set to the right speed.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. So really the long and short of setting this arm up is I'm going to do it without the felt, just because we have the needle, which is, as I mentioned. I felt you would do that. So basically,
sorry.
You lower this down onto in this case, we're lowering it down onto this piece of aluminum. So I'm going to be very gentle. It's not vinyl. and you see that it lowered and is now touching that aluminum.
Right.
So this is most likely balanced, but for the sake of this argument, I'm going to go ahead and unbalance it.
So now you've set that weight back, and now, okay, so now it's pulling up.
Right.
So the closer the closer to the head of the tone arm you put the weight, the faster it's going to drop.
You got
and
it.
you ideally want to, so that it's falling at a slow pace and landing on the vinyl without much force.
For this particular setup, you don't want it to touch the vinyl at all.
Oh, right.
Yep.
But when you have
When it's
a
playing
record
music,
on there, that's when
exactly
you,
right.
okay.
Yep.
And then, so the difference between that and the anti-skate is basically telling the tone arm how fast to come in towards the middle as the
That's a good
album's
way
playing.
to put it. Yeah, how much force to put on the tone arm moving toward the center of the album.
Okay.
Yep, exactly. If it didn't have that, then the record or the tone arm would literally just move right toward the center without hearing any music whatsoever.
Okay, so a pretty essential piece of
It is
of
essential.
the puzzle.
Yep, it is. So now we have the tone arm way off balance. You can see that it's sitting pretty proudly up front there. I'm going to go ahead and turn this down a little bit. And again, right now this is up, and this little lever right here allows you to lower that tone arm onto the record. So what you're looking for is kind of a point of stasis. You want this tone arm to be perfectly level and parallel to this platter, and generally you have to look at it from the side to see if it is. You see here, we're actually still touching.
So if it's touching, you're going to slide the weight back.
Correct. Yep, bring that weight just a little bit back this way from the fulcrum. All right, I think we've achieved it. You can see that the needle is not touching the surface, but the tone arm itself is parallel to the ground or to this platter. Now we go ahead and bring that back up. And if you take a look at that little dial, there are numbers on this dial. You set that to 0, and basically what you're telling the turntable, or what you're telling yourself in this case, is it's now at 0. There's 0 grams of pressure on the needle.
Okay.
So the tracking force is literally at 0 right now. In this case, for the cartridge, and by the way, the cartridge will include in its manual, or in the manual for the turntable, what the tracking force recommendation is.
Okay, so that's something that's important to pay attention to then when you're setting it up for the first time?
You got it.
Okay.
Exactly. If you don't have that information handy, just look up the model number of the cartridge itself online, and I guarantee you'll be able to find the tracking force very easily.
And is that something, so if you purchase your turntable from Apt, we have experts here too who can help you figure out what that number is going to be as well.
That's exactly
correct.
right.
We'll have all that information handy.
Yes,
Perfect.
yes. If you call me, depending on the cartridge, I'll probably know just from memory, sadly. In this case, it's 1.8 to 2.2 grams is the recommended tracking force. So generally I go right in the middle of those two, to 2 grams. There's a little line on the back of this. That's what you're going to be lining it up with. So now we're set at exactly 2 grams. And when I bring this over, you should see it go down at a decent rate, and it just touches that record.
Perfect.
It doesn't come down and bump, it doesn't bounce. That's exactly where you want it. So once that's set, again, you can most likely just leave it. If somebody does bump this, it's not a big deal. Just go through the same process, make sure that that tone arm is level when it's at 0, and set it back to either between 1.8 and 2.2 grams in this case. Some people prefer it a little heavier because you get a little more bass that way.
Okay.
You don't want to go too heavy again though, because you will damage your records if you play them at that rate.
Okay.
Last step, your dust cover. In some cases, turntables will not include a dust cover. If they do include a dust cover, I recommend putting it on. There are many different recommendations when it comes to dust covers and playback, but I really do prefer, and I recommend very highly, that you take the dust cover completely off when you're listening to music. Don't just tilt it back. If you tilt it back like this, that's basically any airborne vibration will affect what's coming through that needle. This is just capturing extra, both air being moved by hopefully your speakers, as well as other air currents that are in the room, and that will affect playback. So the the more kind of separated or isolated you can keep the component, the better. And in most cases, it's very easy to take that top off and leave it off to the side while you're playing back music. Higher end turntables, for the most part, will not include any kind of a dust cover. There's a certain objet d'art, for lack of a better term, of how these turntables are made, and both the manufacturers as well as the listeners want it to be a kind of a point of pride and something that people do see.
Sure.
But as I said before, dust is a big factor when it comes to any kind of audio playback, so keep it on there when you're not using the turntable, and keep those records clean. Keep that needle clean whenever you're playing back. I always recommend that you brush the needle off between each side, so when you flip the record, go ahead and make it a ritual to sweep that that cartridge or that stylus off. We sell brushes for those.
So you do want to use a specific type of brush for something like that?
I recommend it, yeah. Use a very soft brush, something that's not going to affect the playback, because it's a piece of metal, and that metal can get bent. There's a little cantilever that comes down that holds the actual needle, or the, a cantilever that comes down and holds the actual diamond tip or whatever's touching the record.
Okay.
That can get bent. So use a soft brush of some kind, but it has to be firm enough to take away any kind of dust or lint or something that might have settled on the stylus. And there might be some that's picked up even from the record as you're playing it back.
Sure.
So it's always a good idea to keep that clean. You won't then transfer that dust and crud into the next side of your record, or another record for that matter.
Sure. Now, as a novice, is there any benefit to leaving the dust cover closed, or can you leave the dust cover closed while you're playing back an album, or is that very frowned upon?
I frown upon it.
Okay, so probably not the best thing to do then.
Not the best thing for sound quality.
Okay.
But cats, kids, there's a lot of things that are part of our lives. So protecting the vinyl and the tone arm and the needle are critical. So if you are worried about anything getting in the way of playback while you're actually playing a record, by all means, put the cover back on.
Okay.
Yeah. But simplicity is key when it comes to this, and vibration is, you should only hear vibrations that are coming from the needle as a result of going through that groove and not any other reason.
Okay. And then now, speaking of vibrations, I've read a little bit about turntables. Is it the heavier the bass of the turntable itself, the better? Are we talking just to keep vibrations down, or is there something somebody can do if they maybe have a lower end turntable and want to try and soften that vibration, or make it a little less?
Yes. What you're describing is an isolation device. So you can either get feet that go under it, and some are made of sorbothane or material that is engineered by vendors who make a product specifically for that purpose.
Okay. People
will use them for turntables on a regular basis. We sell both of those feet, as well as a full-size kind of a stand that it goes on, the turntable goes on.
Okay.
It really does a great job in lowering that vibration. Anything that's being fed back into the turntable is eliminated for the most part by those isolation devices. The more you can isolate the product, the better. So I always tell people, if you have a real springy floor and you like dancing, put this in a corner. Put it somewhere where you're going to get the least amount of vibration you possibly can. You want to try to keep it away from the line of sight of a speaker, directly behind a speaker, or directly in front of a speaker, again, just because you're going to get sound waves that are coming out. And after all, music is just moving air. So the more you can keep this isolated from that moving air or the vibrations from your floor, walls, whatever it is, the better. So yeah, we have multiple levels of isolation devices, and some mass loading is one way to do it, and that means you're just basically putting more and more weight onto the product to keep it from moving.
Okay.
It's just simple physics. The heavier something is, the harder it is to move. Or if you have a concrete floor, that'd be the ideal place to put it.
Okay.
Rather than a wooden floor. Not everyone has that luxury, myself included. So I had to do some isolation. Some work on isolating the turntable, but it's absolutely paid off.
Okay, and as far as speaker location goes too, then I imagine you don't want your speakers very close to the turntable.
Correct.
At all, because any amount of vibration that produces is going to impact.
That's right. Yep, as a matter of fact, if you turn it up loud enough and there's bass, it'll actually feed back into the because the needle is really just a microphone. It's basically all it is. And any information that picks up will be fed back through your speakers. So those speakers, it's like a feedback loop. And sooner or later you'll get kind of a whine that'll come out of the speakers. If you hear that, turn it down as quickly as you can, just because you might harm the speakers if it's too loud.
Okay.
So I generally don't like telling people to turn it down, but in this case, for safety's sake, it's a good idea.
Sure. All right, well that's a great rundown on how to set it up and a little extra information for all of you out there. Bill, thank you so much for going through all of that with us.
It's my pleasure.
Everyone, thank you as always for watching, and we will see you in the next one.